He stood in front of everyone at the family dinner and said I was no longer his child, but when the lawyer walked into that boardroom 6 months later and handed me the deed to everything, his face went white as snow. The crystal chandelier above us caught the light from the storm outside, casting fractured rainbows across the mahogany table where my father had just destroyed my world. His voice had been steady, controlled, the same tone he used in business meetings when he fired executives. But his eyes held something I had never seen before, a cold finality that made my stomach drop. My siblings sat frozen, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips, while my mother dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. The servers had retreated to the kitchen, sensing the electricity in the air. My father folded his hands, looked directly at me, and said the words that would change everything. "You are no longer welcome in this family or this house." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. This story needs to be told, and I need to know you are ready to hear it. That night 6 months ago feels like a lifetime now, but I remember every detail. The way my father's jaw tightened when I walked into the dining room. The subtle shift in my brother Marcus's posture as he straightened his tie. My sister Elena's perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her wine glass. They had been talking about me before I arrived. I could feel it in the air like static before a storm. My father had summoned me to what he called a family meeting, his assistant calling with that formal tone she used for business appointments. I should have known something was wrong when she said to dress appropriately, as if I ever dressed any other way. I had chosen my best navy suit, the one my grandfather had helped me pick out years ago, telling me that a man's character shows in how he presents himself to the world. The family had gathered in the formal dining room, the one reserved for important occasions and business dinners. My father sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face wearing that expression I knew too well. The look that said he was disappointed but not surprised. My mother sat to his right, her usual spot, her face already showing signs of the tears that would come later. Marcus and Elena flanked the other side, their spouses beside them, all of them dressed as if they were attending a funeral. In many ways, they were. The table was set with the good china, the kind we only used for holidays and special guests. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the silverware gleamed against the dark wood. Everything was perfect, orchestrated, planned down to the smallest detail. My father had always been a man of grand gestures, but this was different. This was calculated. He had built his empire on the ability to read people, to know exactly when to strike and when to retreat. He had taught me that business was war conducted by other means, that sometimes you had to sacrifice pieces to win the game. I just never imagined I would be the piece he chose to sacrifice. The conversation started normally enough, pleasantries about the weather and my mother's garden. But I could feel the undercurrent, the tension that thrummed beneath the surface of polite family dinner conversation. Then my father cleared his throat, the sound that had preceded every important announcement of my childhood. He stood slowly, his hands pressed flat against the table, and looked around the room at each of us. His gaze lingered on Marcus and Elena, a look of pride and approval that I had spent my entire life trying to earn. When his eyes finally landed on me, that look vanished, replaced by something cold and final. He spoke about family legacy, about the importance of the family name, about standards and expectations. His voice never wavered, never showed emotion, as if he was reading from a prepared script. And perhaps he was. He talked about disappointment, about choices and consequences, about how some people simply were not meant to carry the family torch. He spoke about me as if I were not sitting right there, as if I were some abstract concept rather than his flesh and blood. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. Marcus stared at his plate, his face carefully neutral. Elena watched me with something that might have been pity, or perhaps curiosity about how I would react. The staff had been dismissed, the doors closed. This was family business, private business, the kind that stayed within these walls. But what they did not know, what none of them could have imagined, was that my grandfather had been preparing me for this moment for years. Not this exact moment, but for the day when I would need to stand on my own, when the family that had raised me would no longer be there to catch me if I fell. He had seen something in my father that worried him, a hardness that had grown over the years, a willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone for the sake of business and reputation. My grandfather had been building something different, something that would outlast the petty politics and power struggles that seemed to consume our family. The meetings with my grandfather had started when I was 16, quiet conversations in his study, while the rest of the family was busy with their own pursuits. He would call me to his office, that warm room lined with books and filled with the scent of pipe tobacco and old leather. We would talk about business, about life, about the difference between wealth and worth. He told me stories about building the company, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. But more than that, he talked about character, about the kind of man he hoped I would become. He never said it directly, but I began to understand that he was disappointed in the man my father had become. My grandfather had built his fortune through hard work and fair dealing, but somewhere along the way, my father had learned different lessons. He had learned that power was more important than principles, that winning was everything, that family was just another tool to be used in the pursuit of success. My grandfather watched this transformation with growing concern, and in those quiet afternoon conversations, he began to prepare me for a future that none of us could have predicted. He taught me about the real business, not just the public face that everyone saw, but the networks and relationships and quiet deals that really made things work. The irony was not lost on me that as my father spoke about family legacy and standards, he was destroying the very thing my grandfather had worked so hard to build. Not the business, not the money, but the family itself. My grandfather had always said that wealth without family was just expensive loneliness, but my father had forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. He had become so focused on protecting the family name that he had forgotten to protect the family itself. The man who had once taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework had become someone I barely recognized, someone who could look at his own child and declare them dead to him. Marcus had always been the golden boy, the one who said the right things and made the right connections. He had married well, produced grandchildren, and never questioned the path that had been laid out for him. Elena was the princess, beautiful and charming and perfectly crafted for the society pages. She had married into another prominent family, expanding our network and influence. They were both exactly what my father had wanted in children, reflections of his own success and ambition. But I had always been different, always asking questions that made people uncomfortable, always more interested in how things worked than in how they looked. My grandfather had seen this difference not as a flaw but as a strength. He had encouraged my curiosity, my desire to understand not just the what but the why. He had taught me to see beyond the surface, to understand the deeper currents that moved through business and politics and family. While Marcus learned to schmooze and Elena learned to charm, I learned to listen, to observe, to see the patterns that others missed. My grandfather called it having eyes, the ability to see what was really happening beneath the surface of polite society. The catalyst for that night's confrontation had been building for months. I had been asking questions about some of the family's business dealings, questions that made my father uncomfortable. I had noticed discrepancies in some of the reports, patterns that suggested not everything was as clean as it appeared on the surface. My grandfather had taught me to pay attention to details, to follow the money, to understand that in business, as in life, things were rarely what they seemed. But my questions had been met with increasing hostility, with suggestions that I was being disloyal, that I was biting the hand that fed me. The final straw had come 2 weeks earlier, during a board meeting where I had raised concerns about a particular deal. It was a development project that would have displaced a low-income neighborhood, and I had suggested that we look for alternatives that would be less harmful to the community. My father had dismissed my concerns as naive idealism, but I had persisted, citing some of the research I had done on similar projects. The other board members had listened politely, but I could see the looks they exchanged, the subtle signals that suggested I had crossed a line. After the meeting, my father had called me into his office. The conversation had been brief and cold. He had told me that I was becoming a liability, that my bleeding heart was getting in the way of good business. He had suggested that perhaps I was not suited for the family business, that maybe I should consider other options. I had tried to explain my position, to show him the research I had done, but he had cut me off. He had made it clear that my job was to support the family's decisions, not to question them. The meeting had ended with him telling me to think carefully about my priorities, about what was really important to me. I had spent the following weeks trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to figure out how to repair the relationship with my father. I had gone to Marcus and Elena, hoping they might help me understand his perspective, but they had both been evasive, uncomfortable with the topic. Marcus had suggested that I just apologize and move on, that keeping the peace was more important than being right. Elena had been more direct, telling me that I was being selfish, that I was putting my own conscience ahead of the family's welfare. Neither of them seemed to understand that I was trying to protect the family, not harm it. The truth was that I had been spending more time with my grandfather in those final weeks, seeking his advice and guidance. He had been ill, though he had tried to hide it from the rest of the family. Our conversations had become more urgent, more focused on the future. He had talked about legacy, about the difference between inheriting wealth and inheriting wisdom. He had made me promise to remember what he had taught me, to hold on to the values that had built the family fortune in the first place. He had seemed to know that changes were coming, that the family was heading for a crisis. My grandfather had died suddenly, just 2 weeks before that fateful dinner. The funeral had been a grand affair, with politicians and business leaders and society figures all paying their respects. But in the private moments, in the quiet conversations between family members, I had sensed something different. There had been whispered conversations about his will, about what he had left and to whom. My father had seemed confident, almost smug, as if he knew something the rest of us did not. But there had been other conversations too, discussions about lawyers and documents and meetings that would need to be scheduled. The night of the disowning, as my father spoke his final words to me, I thought about my grandfather and the conversations we had shared. I thought about the values he had tried to teach me, the lessons about character and integrity that had shaped who I was. I thought about the research I had done, the questions I had asked, the stand I had taken. And I realized that even though my father was casting me out, even though my family was turning their back on me, I was still the man my grandfather had raised me to be. That knowledge gave me strength, even as my world was falling apart. As I stood to leave that night, my father's words still echoing in the air, I looked around the table at the family I was losing. My mother was crying openly now, her makeup streaked with tears. Marcus and Elena avoided my eyes, their faces masks of polite discomfort. Their spouses looked down at their plates, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. But in that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not just sadness or anger, but a kind of peace. I was free from the expectations that had weighed me down my entire life, free to be the man I was meant to be rather than the man my father wanted me to be. I walked out of that house with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge my grandfather had given me. I had no idea that in 6 months, I would be walking back into a boardroom filled with those same family members, watching as a lawyer handed me the keys to everything they thought they owned. I had no idea that my grandfather's final lesson was still to come, that the man who had taught me about character and integrity had also taught me about patience and justice. All I knew was that I was no longer the family disappointment, no longer the black sheep who asked too many questions. I was simply myself, for better or worse, and somehow that felt like enough. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke as I walked to my car, rain washing the tears from my face and lightning illuminating the path ahead. I drove through the night, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I could never go back to being the person I had been. My grandfather had always said that sometimes we have to lose everything to find out who we really are. As I drove through the storm, I began to understand what he meant. The real test was not how I handled success, but how I handled failure. The real measure of a man was not what he inherited, but what he built from nothing. 6 months later, as I sat in that boardroom waiting for the lawyer to speak, I would remember that night and that drive. I would remember the feeling of freedom that came with losing everything, the clarity that came with having nothing left to lose. But that night, Driving through the storm, I had no idea that my grandfather had been preparing one final lesson, one last gift that would change everything I thought I knew about family, about legacy, about the true meaning of inheritance. All I knew was that I was alone, cast out, and somehow, for the first time in my life, completely free. 6 months had passed since that stormy night, and I had built a quiet life for myself in a small apartment across town. I was working at a nonprofit organization, helping displaced families find housing, when my grandfather's lawyer called with news that would change everything. His voice was formal, but kind as he explained that there were matters regarding my grandfather's estate that required my immediate attention. He said the family had been notified of a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and that my presence was specifically requested. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized this meant I would be seeing my father for the first time since he had disowned me. The law office was located in one of the city's most prestigious buildings, its marble lobby echoing with the sound of expensive shoes and hushed conversations. I arrived early, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted my tie in the elevator's polished surface. The receptionist greeted me with professional courtesy, directing me to a conference room where mahogany panels gleamed under soft lighting. I was the first to arrive, and I used the quiet moments to steady myself, remembering my grandfather's lessons about composure and dignity. The room smelled of leather and old wood, reminding me of his study where we had spent so many afternoons together. My family arrived in a cluster, their voices carrying down the hallway before they entered the room. My father looked older than I remembered, his hair whiter and his face more lined. He wore his authority like armor, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was not as confident as he appeared. My mother followed behind him, her face carefully neutral, though I caught a flicker of something when she saw me. Marcus and Elena entered with their spouses, all of them dressed as if they were attending a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. They took their seats without acknowledging me, the silence heavy with unspoken tensions. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, was a man in his 70s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been my grandfather's attorney for over 30 years, and I remembered him from childhood visits to the office. He arranged his papers with deliberate care, his movements precise and unhurried. The leather briefcase beside him looked well-worn, as if it had witnessed countless important moments over the decades. He cleared his throat gently, and the room fell silent, everyone leaning forward slightly in anticipation of what he would say. Mr. Harrison began by explaining that my grandfather had left very specific instructions regarding the reading of his will. He had wanted the family gathered together, all of us present, before any of the details were revealed. The lawyer's voice was steady as he spoke about my grandfather's wishes, about how important it had been to him that we understand not just what he was leaving behind, but why he was leaving it. He mentioned that there were several documents to be reviewed, some of which contained personal messages from my grandfather to each of us. What none of us knew was that my grandfather had been planning this moment for years, carefully orchestrating every detail of what would happen after his death. He had been watching the family dynamics shift, seeing how his son had changed over the years, how the pursuit of wealth and power had begun to corrupt the values he had tried to instill. My grandfather had built his empire on principles of fairness and integrity, but he had watched with growing concern as those principles were slowly abandoned in favor of profit and prestige. The first document Mr. Harrison read was a letter my grandfather had written to the entire family, explaining his philosophy about wealth and responsibility. His words, read aloud in the lawyer's measured tone, filled the room with his presence. He spoke about the difference between earning wealth and inheriting it, about how money could either build character or destroy it. He reminded us that the family business had been built on serving others, on creating value for the community, not just for the shareholders. As the lawyer read, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, could almost feel his presence in the room. My grandfather had written about each of us individually, his observations about our characters and our choices. For Marcus, he had words of concern about the importance of independent thinking, about not simply following the path of least resistance. For Elena, He had encouraged her to use her intelligence and charm for purposes beyond social climbing. For my mother, he had words of appreciation for her sacrifices and her loyalty. But for my father, his words were different, more pointed, expressing disappointment in the man he had become. The letter revealed that my grandfather had been secretly documenting some of the family's business practices, particularly those that had troubled him in his final years. He had kept detailed records of meetings, of decisions that had been made, of the gradual shift away from the ethical standards he had established. He had been particularly concerned about the development project that had caused my final confrontation with my father, the one that would have displaced hundreds of families for the sake of profit. My grandfather had seen my questions and concerns as evidence of the character he had tried to instill in all of us. But what shocked everyone in the room was the revelation that my grandfather had been secretly grooming me for leadership, not just through our afternoon conversations, but through a series of investments and business arrangements that I had never known about. While I had been working at the nonprofit, believing I had been cast out from the family fortune, my grandfather had been quietly building a parallel empire, one that would eventually be placed in my hands. He had been using his connections and his wealth to create opportunities that would test my character and prepare me for the responsibility he planned to give me. The lawyer explained that my grandfather had established a series of trust funds and investment vehicles that were designed to support the kind of work I had been doing. He had been funding community development projects, affordable housing initiatives, and social services programs, all while keeping his involvement secret. The nonprofit where I had been working had been partially funded by one of his foundations, though even the directors had not known the source of the funding. My grandfather had been watching my work, evaluating my decisions, seeing if I would maintain my principles even when I thought I had lost everything. Mr. Harrison pulled out a thick folder and began to read from my grandfather's personal notes about my character and my potential. He had written about my questions during board meetings, about my research into the company's practices, about my willingness to stand up for what I believed was right even when it cost me dearly. He had seen my disowning not as a failure on my part, but as evidence that I had the moral courage to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. These notes, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, painted a picture of someone he believed could carry forward the true legacy of the family. My father's face had grown increasingly pale as the lawyer read, his confident demeanor cracking as he realized where this was leading. Marcus and Elena exchanged worried glances, their earlier smugness replaced by growing concern. My mother sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. The room felt charged with electricity, as if we were all waiting for lightning to strike. The lawyer paused, looking around the room at each of us, before continuing with what would be the most shocking revelation of all. My grandfather had restructured his entire estate in the months before his death, creating a complex web of trusts and corporations that would ensure his true vision for the family legacy would be preserved. He had been working with a team of lawyers and financial advisors, all sworn to secrecy, to create a structure that would protect his assets from being misused while ensuring they would be used for the purposes he intended. The family business that everyone assumed would pass to my father was actually just one part of a much larger empire, an empire that included real estate holdings, investment funds, and charitable foundations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The lawyer began to detail the extent of my grandfather's hidden wealth, assets that had been carefully concealed from the family for years. He had been reinvesting profits from the family business into a diverse portfolio of investments, all held in trust and managed by professional advisors. He had been buying real estate, funding startups, and creating charitable foundations, all while maintaining the fiction that the family business was his primary asset. The numbers were staggering, far beyond what any of us had imagined possible. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. My grandfather had been secretly documenting my father's decisions and actions, building a case for why he should not be trusted with the family legacy. He had recordings of conversations, copies of documents, and testimonies from employees who had witnessed questionable practices. He had been preparing for this moment, when he would need to justify his decision to bypass his own son in favor of his grandson. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who had lost sight of the values that had built the family fortune. As the lawyer continued to read, I began to understand the full scope of what my grandfather had been planning. He had not just been preparing to give me money, he had been preparing to give me the tools and the knowledge I would need to use that money responsibly. The work I had been doing at the nonprofit, the research I had done on community development, the relationships I had built with social service organizations, all of it had been part of his plan. He had been watching me learn about the real problems facing our community, about the difference between charity and justice, about how wealth could be used to create lasting change. The months since my disowning had been the final test, the ultimate evaluation of my character. Would I become bitter and resentful, or would I use the experience to become stronger and more compassionate? Would I abandon the values he had taught me, or would I hold on to them even when they seemed to bring me nothing but pain? Would I retreat from the world, or would I find ways to serve others even without the family resources? My grandfather had been watching from a distance, receiving reports about my work and my attitude, evaluating whether I was truly ready for the responsibility he planned to give me. The lawyer explained that my grandfather had left detailed instructions for how his estate should be managed, with specific requirements for transparency and accountability. He had created oversight committees, established reporting requirements, and built in safeguards to ensure that the money would be used for its intended purposes. He had learned from watching other wealthy families destroy themselves with greed and infighting, and he had designed his estate plan to prevent those same problems from affecting his legacy. As Mr. Harrison continued to read, I could see my father's composure beginning to crack. His face had gone from pale to ashen, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Marcus and Elena looked stunned, their earlier confidence replaced by dawning horror as they realized what this meant for their own expectations. My mother remained perfectly still, but I could see tears forming in her eyes as she began to understand the full implications of what her father-in-law had done. The lawyer paused again, this time pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandfather's careful script. He explained that this was a personal message from my grandfather to me, to be read aloud to the family as part of the formal proceedings. My hands shook as I took the envelope, feeling the weight of its contents. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind my grandfather had always used for important correspondence. As I opened it, I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, as if he were still with us in the room. The letter was written in my grandfather's voice, addressing me directly but clearly intended for the entire family to hear. He wrote about his pride in the man I had become, about how my questions and concerns had reminded him of his own younger self. He explained that he had always intended for me to inherit the bulk of his estate, but that he had needed to be sure I was ready for the responsibility. The disowning, he wrote, had been the final proof he needed that I would choose principle over profit, that I would maintain my integrity even when it cost me everything. My grandfather's letter went on to explain his disappointment in my father, his concern about the direction the family business had taken under his leadership. He wrote about specific incidents that had troubled him, decisions that had prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability, practices that had harmed the community the business was supposed to serve. He expressed his hope that this transfer of wealth would not just change my life, but would also serve as a wake-up call for the rest of the family about what really mattered. The final paragraph of the letter was perhaps the most powerful, as my grandfather wrote about the true meaning of inheritance. He explained that wealth was not just money, but responsibility, that true inheritance was not what we received, but what we did with what we received. He challenged me to use his gifts not just to benefit myself, but to benefit others, to remember that great wealth came with great obligation. He reminded me that the family name was not just about prestige, but about service, about using our advantages to help those who had been less fortunate. As I finished reading the letter aloud, the room was completely silent. My father sat slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. Marcus and Elena stared at me with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, envy, and something that might have been respect. My mother was crying openly now, though whether from joy or sorrow I could not tell. The weight of what had just happened, of what my grandfather had done, settled over all of us like a heavy blanket. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat gently, bringing our attention back to the practical matters at hand. He explained that there would be documents to sign, arrangements to be made, and meetings to be scheduled. The transfer of assets would take time, he said, but the legal authority would take effect immediately. He handed me a thick folder containing summaries of the various trusts and investments, explaining that I would need to meet with financial advisors and accountants to fully understand the scope of my new responsibilities. But first, he said, reaching into his briefcase one more time, there was one final document to be presented. This was the deed to the family estate, the house where I had grown up, the property that had been in our family for 3 generations. My grandfather had left it to me, along with a note explaining that a house was not just a building, but a home, and that he hoped I would use it to bring the family together rather than to drive them apart. As the lawyer handed me the deed, I looked across the table at my father, seeing in his eyes the full realization of what he had lost. The meeting was drawing to a close, but I could feel that this was really just the beginning. My grandfather had given me more than money, more than property, more than power. He had given me the opportunity to prove that his faith in me had been justified, to show that wealth could be used for good, to demonstrate that true strength came not from what we possessed, but from what we chose to do with our possessions. As I gathered the documents that would change my life forever, I thought about the man who had made it all possible, the grandfather who had seen in me something that even I had not seen in myself. The storm clouds were gathering outside the conference room windows, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. It reminded me of that night 6 months ago when I had driven through the rain, believing I had lost everything. Now I understood that I had actually been gaining something much more valuable than what I had lost. My grandfather's final lesson was about to begin, and I was finally ready to learn it. The thunder outside seemed to echo the silence that had fallen over the conference room as I held the deed to everything my father thought he owned. Mr. Harrison's voice cut through the tension as he explained that the transfer was immediate and legally binding, that I was now the primary beneficiary and executor of my grandfather's estate. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I watched my father's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of hollow acceptance. His empire, built on the foundation my grandfather had laid, was no longer his to command. The man who had disowned me 6 months ago was now looking at the person who controlled his future. My father's voice, when he finally found it, was barely above a whisper. He asked how this was possible, how my grandfather could have hidden so much from him, how he could have been so blind to what was happening right under his nose. Mr. Harrison explained patiently that my grandfather had been planning this transition for years, working with a team of advisors to ensure that his true legacy would be preserved. Every document had been carefully crafted, every legal requirement meticulously fulfilled. There was no mistake, no oversight, no loophole that could undo what had been done. Marcus was the first to recover from the initial shock, his business instincts kicking in as he began to process the implications. He asked about the family company, about his position, about what this would mean for his own future. His voice carried a note of desperation that I had never heard before, the confident golden boy suddenly uncertain about his place in the world. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to position himself in this new reality, how to maintain his status and his income in a world where I now held all the cards. Elena's reaction was different, more emotional, as if she was finally understanding that her entire life had been built on assumptions that had just been shattered. She spoke about family, about loyalty, about how my grandfather's decision would tear us apart. Her voice broke as she talked about the grandchildren, about how this would affect the next generation, about the scandal that would rock their social circles when the truth became known. For the first time in years, I saw vulnerability in my sister, the carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal the person underneath. My mother had remained silent through most of the proceedings, but now she spoke for the first time since entering the room. Her voice was steady but sad as she addressed me directly, telling me that she had always known my grandfather favored me, that she had seen the special bond between us. She apologized for not speaking up during the disowning, for not defending me when my father had cast me out. Her words carried the weight of months of regret, of a mother who had chosen loyalty to her husband over protection of her child. The lawyer continued with the practical details, explaining that I would need to make decisions about the family business, about the various properties and investments, about the charitable foundations that were now under my control. He handed me contact information for the financial advisors and accountants who had been working with my grandfather, people who understood the full scope of what I had inherited. The numbers were staggering, far beyond anything I had ever imagined, wealth that came with responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. But as I sat there surrounded by documents and faced with the stunned expressions of my family, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or vindication, but a deep sense of responsibility and purpose. My grandfather had not given me this wealth to hurt my family or to prove a point, but to continue the work he had started, to use these resources to make a real difference in the world. The disowning had been painful, but it had also freed me to become the person he had always believed I could be. I looked at my father, this man who had shaped my childhood and then tried to destroy my future, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger or resentment, but pity. He had spent his life chasing power and prestige, only to discover that the real power had never been his to begin with. He had sacrificed his relationship with his son for the sake of maintaining control, only to lose that control to the very son he had cast aside. The irony was almost too perfect, but it brought me no joy to see him diminished. Mr. Harrison explained that there were specific provisions in the will regarding the family business, safeguards that would protect the employees and ensure continuity of operations. My grandfather had not wanted his decision to harm innocent people, so he had created structures that would allow the business to continue functioning while transitioning to new leadership. The employees would keep their jobs, the customers would continue to be served, but the direction and priorities of the company would change to reflect the values my grandfather had originally instilled. As the meeting progressed, I began to understand the full genius of what my grandfather had orchestrated. He had not just transferred wealth, he had created a system that would force our family to confront its own values and priorities. My father could continue to work in the business, but under my oversight and according to the ethical standards my grandfather had established. Marcus and Elena could maintain their positions, but they would need to prove their worth through their actions rather than their birthright. The lawyer handed me a final document, a letter my grandfather had written specifically about my father. In it, he expressed his love for his son, but also his disappointment in the man he had become. He wrote about second chances and redemption, about the possibility that losing everything might help my father remember what was truly important. He had structured the inheritance not just to reward my character, but to give my father an opportunity to rebuild his own character, to return to the man he had once been. I made my first decision as the heir to my grandfather's empire right there in that conference room. I looked at my father, this broken man who had lost everything he thought mattered, and I offered him something he had not offered me. A chance to stay, to work together, to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than fear and control. I told him that the family business needed experienced leadership, that I would value his knowledge and expertise if he was willing to work within the ethical framework my grandfather had established. The offer surprised everyone in the room, perhaps none more than my father himself. He looked at me with confusion and something that might have been gratitude, as if he could not understand why I would extend such grace to someone who had treated me so poorly. I explained that my grandfather's legacy was not about revenge or punishment, but about redemption and renewal. The wealth I had inherited came with the responsibility to heal our family, not to destroy it further. Marcus and Elena both spoke up then, asking about their own futures, about whether they too would have opportunities in this new structure. I assured them that there would be places for them, but that those places would need to be earned through their commitment to the values and principles that would now guide our family's business. They would no longer be able to coast on their birthright, but they would have the chance to prove themselves through their own merit and dedication. My mother was crying again, but these were different tears, tears of relief and hope rather than sorrow and loss. She spoke about how proud my grandfather would be to see me handling the situation with such grace and wisdom. She told me that she had always known I was special, that she had seen the qualities in me that my grandfather had recognized and nurtured. Her words carried the weight of a mother's love that had been constrained by family politics, but had never truly disappeared. The practical arrangements took several more hours to complete. There were documents to sign, accounts to transfer, and meetings to schedule. Mr. Harrison explained that the transition would take time, that there would be challenges and complications as we worked to implement my grandfather's vision. But the legal foundation was solid, built on years of careful planning and meticulous attention to detail. My grandfather had anticipated every possible objection and prepared for every potential obstacle. As we prepared to leave the conference room, my father approached me hesitantly. His pride was clearly struggling with his circumstances, but he managed to thank me for the opportunity one had offered him. He admitted that he had made mistakes, that he had lost sight of what was truly important, that the disowning had been a decision made in anger and fear rather than wisdom. His apology was not eloquent or dramatic, but it was genuine, and it represented the first step toward healing the breach between us. The drive home that evening was very different from the storm-lashed journey I had taken 6 months earlier. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and I felt a sense of peace that I had not experienced in years. I was no longer the family disappointment, no longer the black sheep who asked too many questions. I was the keeper of my grandfather's legacy, the guardian of his values, the person he had chosen to carry his vision forward into the future. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings and decisions as I began to understand the full scope of my new responsibilities. The financial advisors walked me through the various investments and trusts, explaining how each piece of my grandfather's empire worked and how they all fitted together. The charitable foundations alone required dozens of hours of briefings as I learned about the programs they funded and the communities they served. The real estate holdings stretched across multiple states, and the business interests touched virtually every sector of the economy. But perhaps the most challenging part was learning to manage the family dynamics that had been forever changed by my grandfather's decision. My father threw himself into his work with a dedication I had not seen in years, as if he was trying to prove that he deserved the second chance I had given him. Marcus and Elena were more cautious, still processing the shift in family power and trying to figure out how to navigate their new reality. My mother became my closest advisor, sharing insights about family history and relationships that helped me understand how to bring everyone together. The first board meeting under my leadership was tense, with longtime employees and business partners trying to understand what changes were coming. I spoke about my grandfather's vision, about the values that would guide our decision-making, about the commitment to ethical business practices that would define our future. Some of the older executives nodded approvingly, remembering the man who had built the company and recognizing his influence in my words. Others seemed skeptical, wondering if idealism could coexist with profitability. I made it clear that there would be changes, that some of the practices that had troubled my grandfather would be discontinued, that we would return to the principled approach that had originally built our success. The development project that had caused my confrontation with my father was one of the first things I addressed, announcing that we would be seeking alternative approaches that would benefit the community rather than displacing it. The decision cost us money in the short term, but it sent a clear message about our new priorities. The community response to these changes was overwhelmingly positive. Local leaders who had viewed our family with suspicion began to see us as partners rather than adversaries. The nonprofit organizations I had worked with expressed amazement at the resources that were suddenly available to support their missions. The employees of our various businesses spoke about renewed pride in their work, about feeling that their efforts were finally aligned with their values. My grandfather had been right about the power of wealth when used responsibly. The money he had accumulated over decades became a tool for positive change, creating opportunities and solving problems in ways that individual effort never could have achieved. The charitable foundations expanded their programs, the business ventures focused on sustainable and ethical practices, and the family name began to be associated with service rather than just success. 6 months after that life-changing meeting in the lawyer's office, I organized a family dinner in the house that was now mine. We gathered in the same formal dining room where my father had disowned me, but the atmosphere was completely different. The table was set with the good china, just as it had been that night, but this time it was for a celebration rather than an execution. My father sat in his old place at the head of the table, but by invitation rather than assumption, and his demeanor was humble rather than commanding. My mother had prepared my grandfather's favorite meal, and we began the evening by sharing stories about him, remembering the lessons he had taught us and the values he had tried to instill. Marcus spoke about conversations with his grandfather that he had forgotten, moments when the old man had tried to guide him toward better choices. Elena shared memories of kindness and wisdom that had been overshadowed by years of social climbing and status-seeking. Even my father contributed, acknowledging the ways his own father had tried to keep him grounded and principled. As the evening progressed, I realized that my grandfather's final gift had not been the money or the property or even the power. His final gift had been the opportunity for our family to find its way back to each other, to remember what we had lost in the pursuit of wealth and status. The disowning that had seemed so devastating had actually been the catalyst for a renewal that might never have happened otherwise. I raised a glass to toast my grandfather's memory, acknowledging the man who had seen potential in me when others saw only problems, who had believed in redemption when others counseled punishment, who had used his final act to heal rather than harm. The tears in my father's eyes as he joined the toast told me that he finally understood what his own father had been trying to teach him all along. The storm that had raged the night I was disowned had cleared, leaving behind a sky full of stars and a family full of possibilities. My grandfather had always said that the true measure of wealth was not what we accumulated, but what we gave away, not what we controlled, but what we liberated. As I looked around the table at my family, changed and changing, I understood that his greatest gift had not been making me rich, but making us whole. In the quiet moments after my family had gone home that night, I walked through the house that was now mine, thinking about the man who had shaped my life in ways I was still discovering. His presence seemed to fill every room, his wisdom echoing in every corner. I made a silent promise to honor his memory not just with words, but with actions, to use the gifts he had given me to continue the work he had started, to prove worthy of the faith he had placed in me. The boy who had been disowned for asking too many questions had become the man entrusted with all the answers. And in that transformation, in that journey from rejection to responsibility, I found the true meaning of inheritance and the real power of love that refuses to give up, even when everything seems lost.